Well, good morning and welcome to Zen Fits. We're continuing with our Tolle quotes, and the one I pulled up this morning is pretty interesting. I'm excited to dig into it, to pull this cotton ball apart. And so we'll start right off. Here's the quote. All these quotes were taken from The Power of Now, by the way. He totally wrote two books, The New Earth and The Power of Now. He's written some smaller stuff, but I think those are his two main books. And these quotes are from The Power of Now, which was the first one he wrote. And so let me read this. Above all, know that the ego isn't personal. It isn't who you are. If you consider the ego to be your personal problem, that's just more ego. Okay. Well, one thing, about this ego is that it seems to be the new devil in town. Religion solves the problem of sin and evil by naming the perpetrator. The devil did it. So one is always fighting the devil. An evangelical relative of mine once, when I told her I was meditating, once said, well, don't meditate. That lets the devil in. And a lot of my evangelical friends on Facebook are in constant fear of and fighting and worrying about the devil. Always running around with caulk and caulking up the holes in the walls and the windows, so the devil can't come in. Like it used to be our house before we got insulated windows. The wind kept coming in through the cracks. Or if you're in a boat and the water's coming in, so you keep caulking up the boat to keep the devil out. Well, that's a difficult way. That's a hard way to live. It's a fearful way of live. It reminds me of a lady that came to my house once when I was doing photography, and she would peek in the door. So, you got any cats in there? And she was afraid of cats. And she was expecting a cat to be behind every couch. And when she went out the door, she was looking to see if any cats were out there. So imagine having to go through life, afraid that in every shadow a cat was hiding. So there's a certain paranoia here that the ego, the ego is a non-religious devil. See, if you want to fit into a biblical framework, well, then you can get the devil. But if you don't want to fit in the biblical framework, the biblical paradigm, then the ego can be your devil. So now you got an ego, and other people will point that out. And it's a strange thing about the ego: you either have too much or too little. If you don't have enough ego, well, then you're kind of like, well, you're a wallflower. You don't have enough ego to do that. And if you're a politician or a CEO or a rock star or something, always got a big ego. So it's it can be a bad thing, or you don't have enough of it, or you got too much of it. And we always point the ego out in other people. And other people were pointed out in us, and then we kind of like maybe take offense at it, you see. So it's very easy to see in other people, but it's not easy to see ourselves with our hand in the cookie jar, you see. So let's take a look at this. Above all, know that the ego isn't personal. It isn't who you are. If you consider the ego to be your problem, then it's more ego. Well, now this is a double bind. This is a catch-22. And it's a spiritual catch-22. For instance, in Zen Buddhism, the founding father of Soto Zen, which is one of the two dominant traditions in Zen. This one mainly is the just sit Zen, just meditate. Dogen and the question that drove he was a 12th century master. The question that drove him to enlightenment or awakening was, if we're already Buddha nature, if we're already enlightened, if we're already Buddha nature, then why struggle? Why practice? Why, so looking back at Tolle then, if the ego isn't who you are, then why do any effort to get rid of it? So, but then the ego is my problem. I mean, I hurt people. I'm always catching myself doing selfish things, you see. That's a problem. Well then, it isn't who you are, so trying to get rid of it is just the ego. But I've got to get rid of it. Aha. There we are in the double bind. If you don't get rid of it, you're wrong. If you try to get rid of it, you're wrong. Stuck. The double bind. Choose this, you're wrong. Choose that, you're wrong. But you got to choose. You got to choose. So the double bind is having to choose between either and or, but you can't, but they're both equal, but they're opposite. This is the problem with logic. Let's take a look at that. Catch the Ego Live is the title today. I thought that was funny because I'm live. But we'll get into that. So classical logic is basically x equals a and, oh, wait a minute. X is a, but can't be not A at the same time. In other words, A is A, but A cannot be B and A at the same time. X equals A. I may screw this up. A cannot well, A equals A can't equal B. In other words, in classical logic, a thing is a thing. This can't be a marker and a piece of paper at the same time. Now, a double bind is when both are equal. So the double bind is that ego is problem and ego is not problem. Okay? So that's kind of like what Tolle was saying. Ego is a problem. I feel it. Ego is not a problem. Now, choose. Okay? If I say ego is a problem, not problem is also true. If I say ego is not a problem, problem is also true. So they cancel each other out. You can't choose, they can't be both logically, they can't be both at the same time. So this is basically the problem of classical logic, which is the logic of thinking. And it gets us into problems when we consider life, because life uses a different logic. Now, quantum physics has come to this point too when it talks about an electron. So the electron, now I'm not a quantum physics, but the electron is a particle and it is a wave. Okay? If the scientist uses one experiment, the electron is a particle. Now, a particle is a thing. Now, a thing, a noun, exists in time and space in a location. And you can see it. It's an object. But if they change the experiment, the electron is a wave. Now, a wave is not a thing. It's not located in time and space, and you can't see it. Why can't you see it? Well, here's a wave, and the observer is a particle. So I'm a thing in time and space. So I observe the particle here. And what do I see is the electron looks like that. But then if I look at it here, the electron looks like that. So each of these, you see, would be an object. You can only see objects. You see, because the wave has no location. So we can only see things that are located. So the dilemma here is that the electron proves to be a wave, but we can only see particles. So how does this work with the ego? So perhaps the ego, like the electron, is both a thing and a wave, or a pattern. See? So a wave is a pattern. Okay? And it repeats itself. Otherwise, otherwise it wouldn't be a wave is a wave because it repeats itself. Otherwise, it would always be different. You see it. So a pattern is a pattern because it repeats itself. We all know that. I mean, you give me a pattern for that. Well, if you forget the pattern for that, I can repeat that. I mean, I can repeat it. A recipe is a pattern. Everything is a pattern. Anything that you want to repeat is a pattern. And so, ego then defies logic because it is A and not A at the same time, but it can only be perceived one or the other, not both at the same time. Yet it is both at the same time. Now this brings up, this is why I love this. This picture, our little gestalt picture, I've brought it up before, I have to do it again, but we got an old woman and a young woman. The old woman is looking this way, and that's her big nose and her eye and her chin. And the young woman is looking that way, and that's her left eye and her left ear and her chin. So you can see the young woman and the old woman. Aha. So here we have the young woman is a wave, and the old woman is a particle. Here's it. The ego as a thing is the old woman. The ego as a pattern is the young woman. So Both pictures simultaneously exist as one, yet they can only be perceived separately. This is not logical, but it's true. Both together are one, but we can only perceive one or the other. And also we notice that if you stare at the old woman, the young woman will rise up, and we see the young woman. Then if you try to hold the young woman, the old woman. So there's an oscillation between the two. You can't hold one without the other one coming through, because they both are of equal value, you see. So perception cannot split the picture and just hold the old woman and repress the young woman. The young woman will come through. So we get this dance then, this play between the thing and the pattern. So let's catch the ego live. All right. So here's the unicorn. Okay. So suppose the ego is the unicorn, and now we got this thing. I suffer because of my selfishness. I suffer because of my contraction. I suffer because I don't feel complete. I suffer because I can't be complete in life. I suffer because I'm always observing myself and judging others and judging the world. And I'm always at odds, you see. That's kind of that sense of who's to blame for that. Well, the moment we stop blaming the world for our suffering is the moment we say, the ego did it. You see, so now I got to go do yoga, and I got to do meditation and go to therapy and do all these disciplines in order to get rid of this ego that has been named. It's just a name, you see, because you can't see it. You've never seen an ego walking around out there, you see. It's a thing that's invisible. So, but we name it so we can talk about it. And then we think the name is the ego. But anyway, maybe that's the problem. We name the ego a thing so we can work with it, try to get rid of it. So that's necessary in order to think about it, to talk about it. The ego is a particle, but the ego is also a pattern, a wave. And you can't see the wave. So a good example of Catch the Ego Live is the popular little story about the kid the cookies are missing from the cookie jar in the kitchen. And mother, each of the kids, all right, did you take it? No. 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 So one night she goes in there and flips the light on in the kitchen. And there's the kid with his hand stuck in the ego jar. His hand is stuck in the cookie jar. You see, right? Caught live. So the wave, the pattern. See, this is what the thing is about the ego. The ego, here, all right, up. Remember the movie Usual Suspects? Well, the character in there, Kevin Spacey, I think he was Charlie something, I forgot his name, but he was like this invisible hand that manipulated everybody in the movie. And at the end of the movie, he said, the devil's greatest achievement was to convince everybody he doesn't exist. So, if the ego is the devil, then the ego's greatest achievement is to convince us that he exists as something to get rid of. But then Tolle says, if you consider the ego to be your personal problem, that's just more ego. So if you try to get rid of the ego, you're deceiving yourself because you're really trying to get rid of yourself, and you can't do that. So the ego creates the double bind to both try to get rid of itself while keeping itself. And that way the ego wins, you see. The ego gets to remain because it tries to get rid of itself. So how do we break, how do we break out of this vortex? So a vortex, if you want to see a vortex, just go fill up a bathtub with water. We don't do that anymore. We take showers. But if you remember ever taking a bath, it's been a long time since I've taken a bath. But you take a bath and you got the plug. The old bathtubs had a plug with a chain. And you pull that plug, you create this. Okay, it's a vortex. And it sucks everything into it. All the soap and all the bubbles and everything floating around in the tub goes down this vortex, you see. So if the ego is a pattern, you see, what does a pattern look like? Well, the pattern is not going to be necessarily like a sine wave. It may be more like a spiral vortex. So when the ego gets activated, suppose you're going for a walk in the park. Oh, you're just fine, you know. No ego. Everything's peaceful. You're just hotty-toddy with the dog. And somebody walks up that maybe you had a confrontation with some time ago, and you see them coming, and the ego rises up and say, trouble, trouble, that person hurt me. I'm either going to avoid them or I'm going to get my revenge. I'm going to restore justice. I'm going to heal the wound that person caused me. Now I've created a vortex. Now I've created a pattern. Okay, and so now the ego as a pattern draws me into the pain of the pattern. And why is the pattern painful? Is because it's not real. It's a repetition of behavior, you see. So it's not live. It's a vortex that sucks everything into it, the other person included. Then their ego gets involved, and now you got two egos like the tomcats having a war to restore peace. So the ego's goal is to restore peace, but it restores peace by creating war. That's the pattern that makes the particle that makes that activates or keeps the ego going. So the ego is not personal. It isn't who you are. So what Tolle is saying is that the pattern is not who you are. But we can't see the pattern because we're in the pattern. You can't see the water you're swimming in, or if you were a fish, you can't see the water in the fishbowl because you can't see the pattern you're in. So this gets back to the live. So seeing the ego has to be catching the ego live. Now, what can catch, if getting back to our cookie story, when the ego's got its hand in the cookie jar, denying that it's taking cookies while it's taking cookies, denying that it's hurting other people while it's hurting other people, denying that it's doing anything it's doing, you see, denying that it exists. What ego, you see? So the denial that it exists has to be caught in the light. Now, when the light comes on and the hand's in the cookie jar, what is the light? What is the light that sees the ego taking the cookie? The live, all right, the light of life. You could say is awareness. Life is awareness. So life is always now. But the ego pattern, a pattern, requires time. A pattern happens in time. So time and the ego go together, and now, this present moment is not a pattern. This present moment is always just this, and it's always new. It's like a fountain. This fountain is not a stream going in a circle. The fountain is bubbling now. So life is always bubbling now. And life itself is aware. Life itself is knowing. Okay? Knowing is a good word. Life knows. So when the practice, all right, so how do we get out of Tolle's double bind? The ego isn't personal because it's a pattern, and you are life. So you are now, you are life, and the ego is a pattern that gets going in a catch-22 circle, out of which it can't get. Boom, boom, boom. And now is not in that because now is not a pattern. Now is alive. You are alive. So when the pain of the ego's pattern becomes insufferable. In other words, I want to stop blaming the world for my pain. I want to see the cause of it. But I don't know who's doing it. I don't know what's doing it, but I'm curious. I want to see. I want to see. So I want to know. So when the pain of the ego happens, when the pattern rises, I can flip on the light of knowing and see myself as the pattern. But the light of knowing is not the pattern. This is very difficult to explain. I hope I'm not screwing it up too bad. So the problem is that we want to be able to see, and the seeing of the ego removes or drops the ego. There's no action involved. There's nothing you have to do, because anything you have to do to get rid of the ego is just going to be the ego trying to get rid of itself, and it's secretly smiles. The ego secretly smiles and deceives itself when it spends all of its effort trying to get rid of itself. Because it gets to have its cake and eat it too. I'm getting rid of my ego. Well, all the time I'm strengthening it, you see. So how to break out of that deception requires seeing or knowing. So knowing is like flipping on the light switch and catching the ego in its own pattern. And then the ego exposed collapses. The game is up. When the ego is exposed to itself, the game collapses, and there is just knowing. Just light left. Just knowing is left. So then the spiritual practice becomes a process of catching the ego again and again and again. And each time we flip the light on, light of awareness on, and catch ourselves in an egoic pattern, the ego loses its strength, and the pattern begins to become less and less and less. And what took maybe decades to escape, now you can see in a few minutes. What used to take years of drama to get out of, now you can see in a moment. The pattern cannot sustain itself when the light of knowing is kept on, you see. So in this way, one gets rid of the ego because there is no effort that you can do to get rid of, if it's personal. In other words, the way to get rid of the ego is not through effort, not through spiritual work, things to do. I'll get rid of, how long do I have to do this before I get rid of it, you see? It's in the practice of creating the conditions for seeing or knowing to rise. So anyway, I hope I haven't been too convoluted here in trying to pull this quote apart. But anyway, I did my best. So I'll see you next time.